At a time of boundless optimism, in a city poised for greatness, Issac Klein puts his faith in science. And 37,000 are left unprepared for the deadliest natural disaster in American history.
This tropical cyclone became a monster.
Millions of tons of weight rising up.
This battering ram crushing everything in its path.
This 25-foot dome of water coming across the city.
It sounded like 1,000 demons screaming in the night.
In the summer of 1900, Galveston, Texas was one of the fastest growing cities in America. But on September 8th of that year, a Category 4 hurricane slammed into its coastline. Within hours, Galveston's hopes were washed away, along with more than 6,000 lives. To this day, the Galveston hurricane of 1900 remains America's deadliest natural disaster. But outside Texas, its horrors had largely been forgotten when author Erik Larson stumbled on the story in a turn-of-the-century newspaper.
One day I was in the library, and there was a headline that I found kind of hard to believe. It said something like 5,000 believed dead in hurricane in Galveston. And I, as a kid growing up on Long Island, was kind of a hurricane junkie. And I'd never heard anything about this hurricane, so I thought, wow, I'd have to read into that.
Larson quickly found that the heart of the history, as it had been told, was the story of Issac Klein. A pioneering scientist, Klein was the head of Galveston's National Weather Bureau office at the time of the storm. According to local legend, he risked his own life to save thousands of others, racing along the beach like Paul Revere to warn of the oncoming hurricane.
Move inland! Take shelter immediately!
My initial encounter with Issac Klein was the standard story in Galveston, which was that Issac Klein was the hero who saved the day.
Hurry! Take shelter!
Then, Larson came across an article written by Klein himself nearly a decade before the storm.
And in this article, Issac Klein talked about how no hurricane could do serious damage to the city of Galveston. And I thought, wait a minute, this is interesting. I mean, this tells me that maybe the legend is not quite accurate.
In his 1999 bestseller, Issac Storm, Larson would recast the last great tragedy of the 19th century as a cautionary tale for the 21st. In doing so, he would rewrite the legend of Issac Klein and the price the city of Galveston paid on that terrible day.
The story of Issac Klein and the storm is the story of technological hubris versus the last great uncontrollable force, which is Mother Nature. It's a story about a man who thought he knew all there was to know about the weather. And then on September 8, 1900, was proven wrong in as dramatic and macabre way as anyone could ever be proven wrong.
(1861). Issac Klein is born in Monroe County, eastern Tennessee, the older of two sons of a prosperous farmer. As a young man, Issac develops a love for nature amid the shifting seasons of the Smoky Mountains.
He spent a lot of time outdoors. Where he lived was really very much the frontier. It wasn't as advanced as other parts of the country at that point.
Young Issac is also captivated by the possibilities of a different frontier: science. In the wake of the Civil War, technology is transforming America. The telephone, the electric light, the phonograph, all are invented when Isaac is a teenager. And with the spread of the railroad comes the prospect that a vast and hostile landscape will soon be tamed.
Where it used to take 6 months to travel across the country, now you can do it in a couple of days. So there's this optimism, there's a feeling of pride that we've done this. We've carved this country out of a wilderness. We can't be stopped.
In 1878, Isaac Klein enters nearby Hiwassee College, where he excels in mathematics, chemistry, physics, Latin, and Greek. He also develops a fascination with the cutting-edge field of meteorology.
In Isaac's time, weather was a fascination, and being a weatherman was a very, very sexy scientific pursuit. Weathermen really believed that they might eventually figure out ways to control the weather.
In 1882, the 20-year-old is recruited into the Weather Service of the United States Army Signal Corps, soon renamed the U.S. Weather Bureau. At this time, the Weather Bureau is just a far-flung system of observation posts scattered around the country. Its forecasts are notoriously inaccurate, and its observers have a reputation for incompetence and corruption.
There was a lot of scandals going on. A lot of the offices were being used for other activities besides studying meteorology.
The chief of one of the Weather Bureau's offices, in addition to observing the weather, was fairly observant about certain other things. He was taking photographs of nude women, which is something that was considered quite scandalous in that time.
To survive, the Weather Bureau would have to clean up its act.
Isaac Klein, being such a forthright, straight-back guy, was considered one of the Weather Bureau's great hopes.
He was intelligent. He was aware of and participated in the latest scientific investigations of his day. And he wanted to bring that expertise and that level of professional behavior and professional deportment or demeanor to the Weather Service.
Isaac begins his career as a forecaster in Little Rock, Arkansas.
The central responsibility of any weather observer was to make a series of very detailed weather observations, always at the same time each day.
You really were limited back then. Basically, what you could see is what you can measure. They could measure the temperature with thermometers. They could measure the pressure with barometers. Some of them had hygrometers to measure the humidity. That's about it. They were very focused on just what they could see right in their immediate vicinity.
It doesn't take long for Isaac to make a name for himself within the Bureau.
He had an inexhaustible level of energy and curiosity. He was a multitasker before the term had ever been invented. In addition to doing all the observations that were demanded of a full-time observer, he went to medical school and became a physician.
Isaac was very ahead of his time. He was well respected because he had 2 college degrees. Most people at that time, they only had 4th grade education or less.
Isaac even finds time for less scientific pursuits. In 1886, after being transferred to Abilene, Texas, he meets Cora May Bellew, an organist at the local church. Within a year, they marry.
Isaac Klein had a reputation for being a very stern person. Conversely, he married a woman named Cora May, who everyone loved. She had red hair, long red hair. She was supposed to be a lot of fun. Very warm, friendly, outgoing, gregarious. It was truly an example of opposites attracting.
On December 10th, 1887, their first child, Allie Mae, is born. 2 more daughters, Rosemary and Esther, will follow over the next 6 years. In 1889, the 27-year-old Isaac receives the assignment of a lifetime. He is chosen to head the U.S. Weather Bureau's office in the thriving port city of Galveston, Texas. In the late 19th century, Galveston is one of the largest cities in Texas, with a population of 35,000 and growing. Built on a long, low island just off the Gulf Coast, it's a town of graceful homes and ornate civic buildings, among the richest cities in the country. Isaac Klein and his family arrive in early 1889 and are nearly overwhelmed by their good fortune.
Galveston was really very much a city on the rise, very much a city on the make, with tremendous aspirations, and that's the environment that he walked into.
But Isaac has no way of knowing the calamity that lies ahead. Already, the seeds of disaster are being sown. By decade's end, his faith in the power of science will come face to face with the deadliest storm in American history.
The Gulf looked like a great gray wall about 50 feet high and moving slowly toward the island.
Grandmother and aunts and uncles, well, their houses was just in splinters. The storm, the 1900 storm, just took every trace away.
(1890), Galveston, Texas. 28-year-old Isaac Klein is just settling in as head of the city's U.S. Weather Bureau office.
Isaac Klein was really one of the best and the brightest of the new Weather Bureau. He was actually put in charge of the entire Texas district, which covered a vast area, which represented, I think, the amount of faith that the Weather Bureau had in him.
Klein's office is on the 3rd floor of the Levy Building, an imposing 4-story brick structure on 23rd Street in the heart of downtown Galveston. There he spends each day taking readings and collecting meteorological data.
The study of weather and the science of weather depended on very rigorous, very detailed, and most people might argue quite tedious rituals of observation. And it was at this that Isaac Klein absolutely excelled. He was precise almost to a fault.
At exactly the same time every day, Klein and his staff telegraph the data they've collected to Weather Bureau headquarters in Washington, D.C.
They would be quickly processed by the forecasters in Washington, who would then, as quickly as possible, relay forecasts back to each office.
Isaac's hard-working demeanor immediately endears him to Galvestonians.
He was a trusted member of the community. He was a churchgoer. He was people when he walked down the street, people knew him, knew who he was.
For Isaac, every day is a reminder of his good fortune. Galveston is a plum assignment, a bustling city with a cosmopolitan flair.
It was a very exciting time in Galveston. We were the first city to have electricity in Texas, gas lighting, telephone, telegraph. We had railroad service between us and anywhere in the United States.
There were these majestic castle-like homes, ornate buildings, quaint Victorian cottages. It was an era of elegance and grandeur and grace and charm.
He was seeing mule-drawn streetcars. You would see men in top hats or derbies and women in their fine wear.
Like many port towns, Galveston is a melting pot, teeming with sailors, European immigrants, and black laborers. It's a city of well-kept churches, tree-lined boulevards, and dozens of saloons. The Strand, home to 5 of Texas's largest banks, is known as the Wall Street of the Southwest. Galvestonians look down on their neighbor to the north, dry, dusty Houston.
Houston was just a little country town in those days, and it was just a little mud hole up the road, so I would say.
Houston was referred to in Galveston as Mudville. People kind of, sort of held their noses when they talked about Houston.
Galveston had its tremendous sense of optimism, its belief that it was going to be the most prominent city on the Gulf Coast, if not in the country, and they had every reason to expect that that would be the case.
But for Galveston, geography is destiny. The city sits on a 3-mile-wide, 27-mile-long barrier island, connected to the mainland by 3 railroad trestles and a wagon bridge. To the north, the shallow waters of Galveston Bay. To the south, the Gulf of Mexico. It's the perfect location for a port, and a strikingly vulnerable one for a city. The highest point on the island, just 8 feet above sea level.
You can't underscore how wrong a terrain Galveston Island was for a city of this dimension, of this level of urbanization at this time.
All that stands between the sea and the city is a streetcar trestle running precariously along the shore. For years, local officials had tossed around plans to build a seawall, but nothing had ever been approved.
Galvestonians had kind of a lackadaisical attitude toward storms in general. It wasn't such a big thing.
In an article in the Galveston News, Issac Klein does his best to dispel any lingering fears. He declares the city safe from hurricanes.
He went so far as to say that anybody who believed that a storm, a tropical cyclone, actually could harm Galveston was the victim, as he put it, of an absurd delusion.
He probably had a bit of hubris there, that he was certain about things that really he should have been, as a scientist, realizing we don't know that much about. He encouraged the development along Galveston Island because he thought, and he was very certain of it, that Galveston would be protected from the storm surge because of the shallow waters.
And Issac clearly believes in his own predictions. He builds his home just 3 blocks from the beach. Perched on stilts, the first floor of the house rests 2 feet above the highest watermark ever recorded in Galveston.
The prevailing belief among his neighbors was that this house was the strongest thing ever to grace the island and would withstand anything that the island had to deliver.
40-year-old Judson Palmer lives close by with his wife May and their 6-year-old son Lee. The families soon become friends. Palmer is head of the local YMCA, one of the centers of Galveston society. Issac, with the help of his wife, fits in well with the city's elite.
Cora May was a vivacious entertainer. She was the kind of person that if there was a death in the family, she would arrive at your house with a casserole.
In 1892, the Galveston Weather Office becomes a family affair. Isaac's younger brother, 21-year-old Joseph Klein, joins the fold.
Brother, Joseph Klein. It's a pleasure to meet you. Joseph, we have an obligation.
Joseph moves in with his brother's family at their seaside fortress.
Timely, accurate fashion. I agree wholeheartedly.
They work side by side, and soon Joseph becomes just as competent in the field as his brother.
Joseph very clearly wanted to be a great weatherman and wanted very much to, I think, to best his elder brother, Isaac.
Wow, the movement across the sky. Now that is not fair.
It's the classic case of the siblings stuck in the shadow of the older brother.
And you compare.
In 1895, the Klein brothers get a new boss, when President Grover Cleveland names 39-year-old Willis Moore to head the National Weather Bureau.
Willis Moore was a very controlling, very, very ambitious man. Moore saw the Weather Bureau as a stepping stone toward greater things.
No, that is not the way that I said we're going to do it.
One of his top priorities was to bring to the Weather Bureau a higher level of credibility.
But the consequences of Moore's ambition will soon leave the city of Galveston dangerously exposed. April 1898, 2 months after the sinking of the USS Maine off the coast of Cuba, the Spanish-American War begins. For years, the U.S. Weather Bureau had relied on Cuban observers to transmit storm warnings to the American mainland. But now, with Cuba under U.S. military control, the Weather Bureau assigns its own observers to the island.
The U.S. weather observers felt that the residents of Cuba were little better than aboriginals. Although I think that on some level they also felt a little bit threatened by the Cuban meteorologists.
Back in the 1890s and early part of the 20th century, the Cuban forecasters were probably the best in the world for understanding and predicting hurricanes. And so they not only had some very good station observations with barometers and anemometers to measure the winds, but they also had a good idea of how the physics worked in hurricanes.
In August of 1900, Willis Moore moves to silence the Cuban forecasters altogether. At the peak of the hurricane season, he decrees that only weather information gathered by U.S. observers can be sent over public telegraph lines.
This was widely protested by the Cuban meteorologists as being not merely, completely arrogant, but also indefensible, because this was hurricane season. This was the time when you most needed to have, the best and most accurate projections you can get.
Meanwhile, somewhere over the Atlantic, a storm is starting to pick up speed. But thousands of miles away along the Texas coast, the city of Galveston is unaware of the unprecedented devastation and death soon to be heading their way. And Issac Klein is about to discover the danger of thinking that one can ever know it all.
My mother could describe the weather like millions of demons overhead. Then she had to get out with
Sounded like a freight train passing over the roof of the house. Water.
She realized that the house was going to pieces around us. We were just waiting for the part we were in to go to pieces.
It's August 1900. William McKinley is president. The American League is formed. A New England diner is touting its newest creation, the hamburger. And Galveston, Texas, like much of the rest of the country, is mired in an oppressive heat wave.
It was one of the hottest periods ever in history. It's extraordinarily hostile in terms of just being able to get around during the day. A 95-degree temperature with, 95% humidity is almost unbearable.
The beaches are filled with bathers, taking advantage of Galveston's Gulfside locale. The island's bathhouses provide a little relief. Made entirely of wood, they sit on a jetty that stretches more than 100 feet out over the water.
The waters were quite warm, but nonetheless, it provided a way to cool off on these brutally hot days.
Issac Klein takes the high temperatures in stride, making his way to his office in the Levy building downtown.
He, as always, was very heavily involved, not just in the Weather Bureau, but in also trying to enrich his mind in other ways. He was pursuing a doctorate at the same time. And he had these 3 daughters, very, very full life.
Very intelligent woman. Very intelligent woman.
Just down the street, Isaac's friend Judson Palmer prepares his lesson plan for this week's Sunday school class at the First Baptist Church. Across town, Rabbi Henry Cohen leaves his house on Broadway and makes his way to work. Cohen presides over Temple B'nai Israel, though his congregation extends well beyond the synagogue.
He was sort of the community's father confessor. People would come to him and talk to them about almost anything that troubled them, their marriages, their sex lives even.
Cohen, in a loving way, was a busybody. He had no qualms about meddling in anything. If he thought it was right, then he stepped into it.
And little beaches and little beaches. I think when you have a place that has a melting pot of persons, they can't have that old dying-the-wool prejudice and bigotry because they know too much about each other.
That melting pot includes 40-year-old August Rolfing and his wife Louisa, both German immigrants.
They were extremely hardworking people. They were what we would call upward seekers now. They were optimistic, as people on the island tended to be.
I'm very excited.
Now their hard work is paying off. They've just moved into a new house, and they have 3 healthy children, a son and 2 daughters. August, a house painter, has enough steady work to finally make the last payment on the family's piano. The Rolfings, Rabbi Cohen, the Palmers, and the Kleins, like many in Galveston, have their eyes fixed firmly on a bright future.
The late 19th century was a period characterized by a sense of boundless hope. Here you had the city of Galveston, just absolutely brimming with optimism, and completely unaware that there were forces at work that were going to change its destiny in a heartbeat.
Even today, with all of our advancements in weather forecasting, no one knows exactly how a hurricane begins. What meteorological shift plants the seed of a deadly storm? What we have learned since Issac Klein's time is how a hurricane builds.
When you look at a hurricane like it's an engine, the fuel, of course, is the ocean, the warm ocean waters. The mechanism that gets that going is some semblance of a low pressure area, and then it feeds on itself. And then the thing you really need to get one going is little or no wind shear. And by that we mean the winds are not blowing too hard, and they're generally blowing from the same direction in the middle and upper levels of the atmosphere as they are at the surface.
When these swirling winds reach 74 miles an hour, a hurricane is born.
Hurricanes are an amazing phenomenon. I mean, the amount of energy they release every day, if you could harness that, you could power the whole world's electrical needs.
Today, hurricanes have names, like Andrew, which caused over $20 billion of damage to southern Florida and Louisiana in 1992. And Hugo, a 1989 hurricane with wind speeds that broke 150 miles per hour. Hugo was what's known as a Cape Verde, a hurricane that originates as a tropical wave off the coast of West Africa, and then makes its way across the Atlantic. It was that same phenomenon that in the summer of 1900 would become the engine of Galveston's doom. August 30th, a small tropical storm travels west over the open sea.
The storm moved off the coast of West Africa and continued as really a fairly modest tropical cyclone for most of the way across the Atlantic.
On September 3rd, the storm hits Cuba. For the next 2 days, torrential rains pummel the island.
Usually a storm moving at the end of August, early September in the deep tropics like that has a pretty good chance of becoming a hurricane fairly quickly.
American weather observers in Cuba wire Washington that they expect the storm to head northeast toward Florida and then up the east coast, the typical path for what looks to them like an ordinary tropical storm.
Between the U.S. weather observers, there was nothing really to read into the storm. And yet the Cubans, who had had experience with many different kinds of hurricanes, knew that something was off.
The Cubans are convinced the storm will veer west toward the Gulf of Mexico. But because Willis Moore, the head of the U.S. Weather Bureau, has cut off their access to telegraph lines, their concerns never make it to the mainland. Meanwhile, atop his offices in the Levy building, Issac Klein and his brother Joseph keep a close watch on their instrumentation. Isaac has seen the reports coming out of Cuba. He remains confident that no storm will ever seriously harm his city. But all his certainties are about to be washed away by a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale.
My mother, when she realized that the water was going to come in the house, she went out, got an axe. She chopped holes. Water would come up into the house and held the house on the ground.
The house
Yes,
went,
she
just
chopped
collapsed. We were underwater. I never moved. We just sat there and drifted. We had left them.
Remember that we were all frightened. My sister and I were the only two children. The water kept coming up higher during the storm.
Wednesday, September 5th, 1900. For the past 2 days, a tropical storm has been drenching Cuba, and now it's slowly moving north. News of the storm reaches Galveston, Texas that day, but it barely even makes the papers.
Buried deeply in the back pages, there is this first mention of a tropical storm. No one paid very much attention. Tropical storms are not unusual in this part of the world. Galvestonians were very familiar with them. There were certain indications that you looked for. There was a weather service station here on the island. People thought that the weather service would keep them apprised of what was happening and what was coming.
Isaac, this just came in from Washington on the wire.
Galveston's Weather Bureau Chief, Issac Klein, is receiving regular updates about the storm from headquarters in Washington, D.C.
Significant changes?
No, nothing we wouldn't expect, right?
That's good.
None of them mentions the word hurricane. Thursday, September 6th.
It was pretty much an ordinary summer day in Galveston. Issac Klein, as usual, went to the top floor of the Levy building in Galveston to check his instruments. Temperature was 90.5 degrees, quite hot, especially given the humidity. He monitored cloud cover, the winds and so forth, but really there was nothing extraordinary about the day.
The report from Washington states that the storm is passing over Florida and heading up the Atlantic coast towards New England.
When this storm came off of Cuba, it turned due north. It went through the Florida Keys, or just to the west of the Florida Keys, and then paralleled the southernmost part of the Florida Peninsula.
Issac Klein leaves work that night confident that the Bureau's forecast is correct, and that once again, Galveston will be spared the sea's fury. But nature has a different plan in mind. Sometime that night, the storm shifts west toward the Gulf of Mexico.
And that's where they lost track of it. It was away from land, it was out in the open water, but at the time, what they knew of storms then was that they keep moving north.
Their assumption is wrong.
It hit the Gulf of Mexico, which already was superheated from an especially hot summer. What you had then was essentially a machine, a heat engine with almost an inexhaustible supply of energy to draw upon.
The wind speed builds as the storm feeds ravenously on the heat of the Gulf water.
It keeps strengthening and it reaches hurricane strength, which is 74 miles an hour. Now we've got a hurricane.
This giant storm was moving forward probably at about 10 miles an hour, very slowly, which is significant because as it moves, building more and more power, suddenly this fairly routine tropical cyclone became a monster.
September 7th, 1900. It's a hot and muggy Friday. The humidity is almost unbearable. The waves lapping against Galveston shores are as warm as bathwater. Isac's mood, indeed that of the whole town, is buoyed by a headline in the Galveston Daily News. The new census figures are out. The city's population is 37,789. In less than 10 years, Galveston has grown by a staggering 30%.
This city was absolutely convinced, beyond doubt, that it was going to become the New York City of the Gulf. This is almost as if Mother Nature were saying, just as the storm is approaching, we just want you to be aware of how many people you stand to lose.
The hurricane is relentlessly making its way towards the island. 120-foot swells ripple across the Gulf. Winds over 150 miles per hour scream westward along the open sea. Pressure plummets around its eye, and spiraling winds carry air at over 1 million tons per second.
The key part of the storm is an area known as the eye wall. It's the intense band of convection that forms around the center of low pressure. The very high winds are concentrated around that core of thunderstorms in the middle of the hurricane.
Along the eye wall, the winds begin to blow so fast they create a centrifugal force. They are literally lifting the surface of the sea, creating a huge circular formation that stretches up to 2 miles above the open water. The ocean rushes outward from the core of the storm, producing what is often the most lethal part of the hurricane, the storm surge.
Storm surge is one of the most deadly threats that a hurricane presents as it's making landfall. Probably the best analogy would be to say if you have a plate and you put a little bit of water on it, then you blow the plate, blow on a plate, what happens? Well, the water's gonna flop right off. Same thing when you get a shallow body of water like the Gulf of Mexico is. A hurricane comes along, it pushes all that water onto land, and if it gets to be 10, 15, or 20 foot high, people drown.
That mass of water is now headed straight for Galveston, Texas, a city where the highest elevation is just 8 feet above sea level.
This whole situation was just poised for a disaster. You had all these thousands of people living right next to the coast on an island that's only a couple feet above sea level. It's the heart of the hurricane season, so it's almost the worst case scenario.
In 24 hours, Galveston will make history as the site of America's deadliest natural disaster. Friday, September 7th, 1900, Galveston, Texas. The day begins with little indication that a marauding force is sweeping across the Gulf of Mexico towards the island. 38-year-old Issac Klein, the man responsible for knowing just what weather is coming to Galveston, remains unaware that a hurricane is heading their way. That morning, he stands on the city's Gulf shore and carefully surveys the sea.
What was happening that Friday morning was a strong wind coming out of the northwest, and the tide is rising. Now, this is an unusual circumstance. When the wind is out of the north, and people in Galveston joke about this, you can almost walk across Galveston Bay. The wind from the north literally drives water out of the bay. He knew the name for this. This was called a storm tide.
We started getting swells, which were little larger waves that came farther apart and pounded up onto the beaches with a different sound than the standard waves.
Far in advance of hurricanes, Often, people at the beach will see these fairly large waves, and they come at long intervals, maybe a couple minutes between each. And they're actually swells that are generated by the hurricane, and they move way in advance of the storm. So it's kind of a precursor.
When Isaac returns to the office, a new report is waiting from headquarters.
This just came in from Washington.
The tropical storm they thought was heading north has now veered west, and Galveston should brace for high winds and heavy rain.
Wind speeds are fine. Keep me abreast.
Isaac isn't worried.
Sir.
As he himself wrote 9 years ago, the thought that any storm could seriously damage Galveston is an absurd delusion. And while the day is hot and humid, the barometer isn't falling, and wind speed remains stable. Somewhere out in the Gulf, ships are being lashed by the hurricane, but Isaac has no way of knowing that.
There is no ship-to-shore communication at this point. So even if a ship encountered this hurricane, they had no way of getting word to shore. So Klein and all of the weather stations at this point are relying only upon other land-based weather forecasting installations.
Isaac Klein puts all of his faith in those limited tools. Like many of his era, he believes that the technology right in front of him is all that he needs. Along the beach, Galveston residents play in the surf. Among them are the children who live at the nearby St. Mary's Orphanage.
The orphanage was a very large, gloomy, perhaps castle-like structure on the beach. And the way I picture it is just sort of rising from this flat portion of Galveston among the seagrass.
The orphanage consisted of two large, two-story dormitories with balconies facing the beach. And they were right off the beach, just behind salt cedar trees and large sand dunes. There were 93 children and 10 sisters.
They watch as the waves crash noisily into the Galveston shore. Isaac finishes his workday and returns home to his wife and 3 daughters.
You good girls today?
Isaac's wife, Cora May, is in the midst of a difficult pregnancy and retires early. All over town, Galvestonians go about their normal routine. May Palmer brings her husband Judson a cup of tea. August and Louisa Rolfing play with their kids in their new home. Rabbi Henry Cohen conducts Friday night services.
At 6 o'clock, when the bells stopped ringing, Rabbi Cohen began the service. And by 7 o'clock, when the bells were ringing, he was at his dinner table.
And by midnight, the town's most eminent weather professional is in bed. Isaac's home is just 3 blocks from the beach, close enough to feel the reverberations from the pounding surf.
That night, he awakens to a persistent sense that something's not quite right. But again, he had no particular concern that anything was coming.
Isaac falls back to sleep in his impregnable house, feeling safe, secure. There is one man in Galveston, however, who is very concerned. In fact, he's certain that death is riding on these Gulf waves.
About 4 a.m., Joseph Klein, Isaac's younger brother, knocks on Isaac's door. He has this sense of impending doom. He feels that something very much out of the ordinary is occurring.
What is this about? It's not right, Isaac. Something is not right. Something is not right. No. Have you looked outside? Have you seen what's coming? The storm is on our doorstep.
And he said, in effect, it started. The worst is about to happen.
Isaac, I just have this feeling.
Isaac, of course, is the scientist, the man who lives by numbers and observations and technical accuracy. He dismisses Joseph's concerns, says that that he will be the one who will determine whether or not to notify Washington of anything unusual happening that day.
I will go to the office.
Isaac assures his brother that they can check their instruments in the morning to see if Joseph's premonitions have any basis in actual science.
Scientific fact. I will make the decision, not you, Joseph. This is your mistake to make.
He was a scientist to the very core, and science meant numbers and firm, correct, rational observation.
That morning, September 8th, Isaac returns to the beach and once again observes the high, slow swells.
He clearly knows that this is unusual behavior for the Gulf of Mexico. He is not at all certain what it indicates, and indeed fails to recognize that these swells were an indication of tremendous energy being broadcast forward from a large storm.
By mid-morning, rain begins to fall, and Isaac hurries to his office in the Levy building. The barometer has fallen just 1/10 of an inch. In a telegram to Washington, however, Isaac does mention one striking phenomenon. Such high water with opposing winds, he writes, never observed previously.
So as of early Saturday morning, Isaac Klein, chief weatherman in Galveston and also for Texas, remained completely unaware that life was about to change in a way that no one could ever have conceived.
By the end of the day, this city will find out just how high these ocean waters can go and how much life they can sweep away. It is the year 1900, and Galveston, Texas is poised to propel itself into the new century. A busy port, a burgeoning population, an abundance of wealth. Townspeople believe their city is well on its way to becoming one of the most important in the nation. But today, Saturday, September 8th, that dream will die.
No one even faintly suspected the disastrous tidal wave that was so swiftly moving in from the depths of the Gulf.
9 a.m. The hurricane is about 50 miles off the coast. 150-mile-per-hour winds are already pushing huge waves up against the coastline.
Here we are Saturday morning. The storm's probably at its same intensity that's going to make it landfall, so we're looking at 120 to 140 mile-an-hour winds, a Category 4 hurricane heading towards landfall.
Galvestonians have no idea of the monster lurking in the Gulf. Their own weather expert, Issac Klein, has not raised the hurricane warning flag above the U.S. Weather Bureau's offices in the Levy building.
People trusted their brick structures. They trusted the fact that Galveston had endured storms before. They trusted Issac Klein and the Weather Bureau. All that they would see, if they happened to glance toward the Levy building or any of the other places where weather signals were posted, was a storm flag, a routine storm flag. And there are many summer storms in Galveston, but then they pass.
That morning, Isaac tells several merchants that while there will be a storm that day, he expects only minor flooding.
They're just now getting the increasingly heavy outer squalls, and by mid-morning they get into constant rain. So they're getting into the core of the storm at that point.
Soon, the winds reach 40 miles an hour, and water begins flowing into Galveston's low-lying streets. Still, the city goes about its routine.
People were on their jobs. They were out, making their livings. There was a feeling, I'm sure, that, well, okay, here it is. We'll ride it out. It'll be over tomorrow, and we'll get back to business.
There was the sense of great celebration, that here it was the end of the summer, a long, hot summer. It was a day for celebration, and if you were a kid, for great fun. Leaping off your porch into a stream of water racing past.
It's like a circus. The children are singing and everybody's having a good time. Rabbi Cohen, who lived on Broadway, came out and started passing out umbrellas to people, and his wife were giving the children apples.
But as the wind picks up speed, the carnival atmosphere starts to disappear.
You're being silly. You're really being...
You had August Rolfing, the painter, leaving his wife and going back to do one of his painting jobs, even though his wife, Louisa, was quite nervous. She urged her husband to stay home, and he just brushed it off, says, we've been through storms like this before.
Please, Judson, please don't go.
May Palmer tearfully asks her husband, Judson, to stay at their house, which is just a few blocks from Issac Klein's.
Please don't go. I've got to go.
He, too, ignores his wife's pleas and heads off to work.
Very careful.
By noon, gale force winds are tearing at the island. Mammoth swells pound the coast. The hurricane has arrived.
People then started coming up from the beaches saying the bathhouses are being crushed. Suddenly, there's this sense of maybe this is not so funny after all. Maybe this is a little different.
By 12:30, the streetcars are unable to move. The water is rising higher. The ocean is threatening to swallow Galveston whole. Louisa Rolfing has seen enough.
August?
She wants her husband home now.
She sent her eldest son to tell August to come home immediately.
Find Papa and tell him I want him home now, okay?
Her son reported back later, Papa says, "You must be crazy. He will come home for his dinner as usual."
"2:30 p.m. From the weather station at the Levy building, Issac Klein can see the water rising in the streets of Galveston.
Even Issac Klein was beginning to realize that something extraordinary might in fact be occurring.
Wire Washington, I'll raise the flag.
Klein instructs his brother Joseph to cable Washington that Galveston is in dire straits. He raises the hurricane flag, but it's much too late. The 37,000 residents of Galveston have nowhere to go.
The island was cut off fairly early. The trains can't run. The trains can't reach the island at a fairly early time period that afternoon. So it's impossible, even if you wanted to leave, to be able to.
Our first realization of something bad was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, this lumber floating by. We could hear the cows mooing, dogs barking, the shouting, and one thing and another. At about 4:30...
All of a sudden, my sister screamed and pointed into the door into the room next door, and that wall was leaving that ceiling. It was going out each time a gust of wind would come.
Issac Klein leaves the bureau offices and makes his way to his house by the sea.
Isaac.
On his way home, he sees Judson Palmer.
My wife and child.
Palmer's wife and 6-year-old son are back at home, a few doors down from the Kleins. He asks Isaac if he should be worried. Isaac tells Palmer that his family will be safe in their house. Palmer, his fears calmed, returns home.
All right. I hope you're right.
By the time he reached his house, the water was up to his waist. You had powerful gusts of wind sweeping across the surfaces of the water, and a lot of the landmarks were beginning to disappear because of the height of the water.
Palmer hugs his wife, May, and tells her to get ready to ride out the hurricane.
We're gonna ride it slow with Isaac.
Isaac gets back to his house as well. When he walks in the door, he is greeted by his pregnant wife, his 3 daughters, and dozens of Galvestonians.
As soon as they realize that this is not going to be just a tropical blow, they immediately think of safe havens on the island. Issac Klein, for example, the head of the Weather Service, had just built this wonderful new house that was supposed to be storm-proof.
Remain calm, you're safe here. This house is solid as a rock.
When Issac Klein returned to his home, There was approximately 50 people that had already gathered there, them knowing that Dr. Klein, being so brilliant, if any house could make it through the storm, his could.
But there is no safe place in Galveston today. And in fact, Issac Klein's fortress will prove to be one of the worst places in the city to try and weather the storm. It is late afternoon on September 8, 1900, and Galveston, Texas is caught in the grip of a ferocious hurricane.
The winds pick up to this 100 miles an hour. At 100 miles an hour, roughly, the wind just peels off the surface of the ocean, so you're having nothing but white foam flying by.
There were the rising swells, the heavy flooding, the accelerating, intensifying wind. Imagine the terror that you would feel facing this kind of circumstance. There's no power. There is absolutely no communication with the outside world. All the telegraph and telephone lines have been knocked out. All the bridges to the mainland have been torn out. So you are completely and utterly alone. And now for a lot of people, that was must have been just an incredibly horrifying moment.
The bay water was coming in from the bay. The bay and the Gulf waters were meeting. The tide had come up so high when we entered our
There
home.
was nothing there to stop the water from coming. At that time, the city was below sea level.
Near the shore, St. Mary's Orphanage is under siege.
The 93 orphans were attended by 10 sisters. They quickly began herding the children back through successive parts of the orphanage. No sooner would they evacuate one portion for the other than the place they had just been was literally gnawed away by this giant storm. It's as if some giant, horrific dinosaur were chasing them through the house.
The sisters gathered the children in the chapel. They had the children sing Queen of the Waves again and again in an attempt to calm them down, but the waters continued to rise.
Across town, Rabbi Henry Cohen looks out his window. He watches the waters rise, watches as his city begins to disappear. He tells his wife Molly to play some music. He nods towards their children.
I don't want them to see the water rising.
Molly sits down and begins playing the piano as the winds howl outside.
In a world that was just falling apart around them and where nothing was common or known, here was something that they could hold on to.
Nearby, Issac Klein has a full house. Along with his wife and 3 children, more than 50 Galvestonians have taken refuge in his supposedly indestructible house. At 5:30, Isaac's brother Joseph makes it home from the Weather Bureau offices. He tells Issac that, incredibly, the storm is gaining strength. Joseph believes that staying this close to the coast will mean certain death for everyone in the house. He is convinced their best chance for survival is to make a run for the center of town.
Here's where this simmering conflict between Issac and his brother Joseph begins to flare. Joseph thinks he's got a better sense of what's going on than Issac. He recommends, very strongly recommends, that everybody leave. Issac disagrees. Issac feels that they should stay put, that that's the safest way. Issac Klein was pretty confident that he had built this thing to withstand anything that the Gulf could deliver.
6:15 p.m. As the 2 men argue, the winds of the hurricane shift direction. Now they are coming from the west. It is a telltale sign that the eye wall of the hurricane has arrived.
The eye wall of the hurricane is the absolute worst, the very strongest thunderstorms, the highest winds, torrential downpours. You couldn't see anything in it. The storm surge hits its peak as the eye wall encounters the island. That's where the deepest water is and the highest push.
6:30 p.m., Isaac stands at his door. 120-mile-per-hour gusts shriek past his home.
Embedded in all that water that's going on here, you have the debris from houses that have already been destroyed flying by at high rates of speed, hitting your building, and the noise, and that lasts for hours.
Then something truly remarkable happens. The sea itself rises 4 feet in 4 seconds. And if you can try and think about what that meant for people throughout Galveston, it was an incredible moment. You've got this 25-foot dome of water coming across the city of Galveston. The entire city was inundated with water.
The storm surge hits the island, and I think this is where people realized, oh my gosh, that wasn't the worst. You know, this is the worst.
August Rolfing can't make it home. The water downtown is too deep and pouring into buildings. He seeks refuge in a store.
Everybody had to get up onto furniture in this store. At one point, August Rolfing is standing on top of a counter. He lifts a boy in the store up onto his shoulders because the water's gotten to the point where even if the boy is on top of the counter, the water's rising too fast, it's going to drown him.
At St. Mary's Orphanage, 93 children are in mortal danger as the structure begins to collapse under the force of the storm.
The sisters took clothesline and they cut it into sections, and each sister tied to her own body between 6 and 7 children in an attempt to try to save these children by keeping them together. The waters filled the first floor, and then eventually it lifted the dormitory. It floated briefly, and then the bottom fell out and the roof came crashing down, trapping the sisters and the children.
Suddenly, the clothesline became a serious liability because, yes, it was holding the kids together, but it also became a great way to get tangled in debris. All it took was to catch one kid, and you caught the whole string of kids.
Just down the street from Isaac Klein's house, Judson Palmer and his family have been thrown into the churning water. Their home, like so many others, has been destroyed by the storm.
Where's the boy? Where is he?
In the darkness, Judson first loses sight of his 6-year-old son, and then his wife, May. The island of Galveston is now completely underwater, and the ocean isn't the only killer out there. Many of the roofs in the city are covered with slate tiles, which are now being borne aloft by gusts up to 140 miles per hour.
The slate tiles ripping off the rooftops were cutting through the air and taking people down, just like the medieval army of archers shooting their wall of arrows and hitting their targets.
The sounds were awesome. Children calling for their mothers, women screaming for help, men begging for mercy from God. Then those sounds would be abruptly cut off. Someone's life had ended.
Isaac Klein's house is still standing, though rapidly filling with water. More than 50 people remain huddled together. But the violent storm surge makes their chances for survival look increasingly grim.
And that giant rise of water, that's millions of tons of weight rising up and battering into homes, buildings, railroad trestles, anything in its path, and it's going to take them out. It's going to roll and just pound and pound and pound.
3 blocks from Isaac's house, the storm is tearing at the massive steel girders of the streetcar tracks. Then, suddenly,
This huge streetcar trestle breaks away from its pilings and begins spinning and turning like a giant scythe heading in their direction.
Coming right toward the house very slowly, with almost cinematic slowness, was this massive floating reef of steel headed right toward this house full of 50 people.
Isaac can see this out the window, and he realizes that the end is near.
Joseph grabbed the two children nearest him and just crashed out through a window. As the house fell around him. Isaac is underwater at this point. He's crushed under debris. There was no way for him to escape, and he began saying his goodbyes to the world. And then miraculously, he is freed, perhaps by some new motion of the onrushing storm surge, who knows what. But suddenly he finds himself on the surface.
He sees in a lightning flash his youngest daughter. He gets her, and they begin to ride on a raft of debris. And then in another lightning strike, he sees his brother Joseph and his two other daughters. And so they unite on a single piece of debris.
Isaac! Isaac! Isaac!
Isaac clutches his three daughters, breathless with relief that they're still alive. But his wife, Cora May, is nowhere to be seen.
So here they are, moving through the night over a landscape that is, unrecognizable. Unaware, perhaps, that underneath the surface of the water were, at that moment, many, many thousands of corpses in the city of Galveston.
It is just after midnight on September 9th, 1900, and a killer hurricane is ravaging Galveston, Texas. Almost the entire island is underwater. Thousands of residents are floating on debris. Thousands more are dead, hidden somewhere in the devastated landscape that was once a hopeful city. Isaac Klein, his three daughters, and his brother Joseph have spent the last few hours clinging to a raft of shattered wood.
They were on this debris in howling wind, pelting rain, with the sounds of mayhem all around them. Buildings being destroyed, the shrieking of people.
After more than 12 hours of driving rain and hurricane-force winds, the storm finally begins to die down. Before dawn, waters that had risen as high as 15 feet above sea level start to recede. August Rolfing, who took refuge in the storm at a local store, goes out into the blackness in search of his family.
He could just imagine what was under the debris, the possessions from people's homes, people, dogs, cats, children. What a stunning moment it must have been for him to realize the ferocity of the storm and the damage it had done. And of course, he still doesn't know if his wife is safe at this point.
After a long and really terrifying search, he was at last reunited.
Isaac Klein and family have finally come to rest in the receding flood.
The raft of debris floated to safety near his house, which is kind of miraculous given how far the sea had pushed it.
Rabbi Henry Cohen and his family have survived the hurricane near the center of town. They are among the lucky ones. In just a few hours, the Cohens, like the rest of Galveston, will be confronted by a scene almost too horrible to comprehend.
When the sun comes up Sunday morning, it's a calm, peaceful day, clear blue sky. The Gulf is totally tranquil.
As people emerged from their houses, as they crawled from whatever raft of debris had allowed them to survive, they looked out on a landscape unlike anything they had ever seen. It was as if the wind had disassembled everything, board by board, and then just hurled the boards in haphazard fashion.
On the morning of the 9th of September, we didn't know what had hit us. There was no water.
People
The
were
storm had
passing
abated.
by, screaming and crying for help, and had no clothes on. The wind had ripped all their clothes off.
The survivors gathered outside after they could find dry land to stand on and just started praying and singing. Praying and singing.
They could hear the cries of people buried under the debris. And at first, their impulse, of course, is to dig them out, to use their hands, to use any kind of tool they can find.
But many are buried so deep that rescuing them is impossible.
They come to realize that it's too late. There's nothing they can do for them. They'll cry themselves out and finally die.
The dead, thousands upon thousands of them, are everywhere.
They began to realize very soon, as the morning advanced on Sunday, September 9th, that the loss of life had been quite significant. First of all, there was the mounting, sickening odor of the city.
Taking care of the bodies is one of Galveston's immediate concerns. Death gangs are formed to roam the city, collecting corpses.
There was a man in a journal who wrote that he found a small child buried in the sand dunes on the beach. But he picked up this child, and then he saw that there was a rope around the child. And he said he pulled on the rope, and there was another child. And then he pulled on the rope again, and there was another child, and then another, and another. Finally, taking him to the body of the sister.
It is the children and nuns of St. Mary's Orphanage.
It turned out that only 3 of the 93 children had survived, and none of the sisters.
There are thousands of corpses and no way to bury them in the waterlogged sand of Galveston.
So they decide that the only thing to do is to load the bodies on barges and take them out to sea and dump them. And they actually commandeer people at bayonet point, and black people mostly, and force them to do the dirty work.
They gave them unlimited supply of whiskey, try and help deal with the horror.
2 days after the first barge is sent out to sea, the now bloated corpses return, swept in by the Gulf tide.
It was then when the city fathers realized, well, there was only one solution. The decision was made to burn the bodies in place. If you found 10 corpses in an area, you would burn them there.
All across the island, you can see these funeral pyres, and the people who were there will never forget the smell of that. And the fires burned night and day for several weeks.
I'd stand out there and watch them burn the bodies, and then I'd have nightmares and scream.
Judson Palmer survived the storm, but he is one of the many people in Galveston who watched the fires with a dull horror. His wife, May, has been found crushed to death by debris. And somewhere out there, perhaps on one of those terrible pyres, is the body of his 6-year-old son, who was swept away when the Palmer house fell to the storm. With telegraph lines down, it takes days for word to reach the rest of the country about the tragedy in Galveston. It's only then that assistance begins to arrive. The devastation is captured by a cutting-edge invention.
There was a gentleman who was working for an inventor, Thomas Edison, and he had just invented a new contraption called the movie camera. Well, the gentleman lied to the people who were guarding, who came and went off of the island, and said that the movie camera was survey equipment used to rebuild the island.
Some buildings survived, and those served as landmarks, but those only, in a sense, heightened the awesome destruction, because they showed you by refraction what was no longer there. I mean, here was one building that you did recognize, but nothing around it was there, and it told you how great the loss was.
Within a week, Red Cross pioneer Clara Barton is also on the scene. She helps focus national attention on Galveston.
She publicizes her opinions about what she's seen and that they're horrible. There are donations anywhere from a dime to hundreds of dollars and thousands of dollars that come from across the country to the Red Cross to be used in relief efforts.
Mrs. Clara Barton dressed my sister in a Red Cross uniform, then became, what shall I say, the city caught its second breath. Order had commenced to develop out of chaos.
The funds provide survivors with clothes, food, shelter. But no amount of money can ease the agony of Galveston residents, many of whom continue to search for their lost loved ones. Issac Klein is slowly losing hope that he will find his wife Cora still alive.
What followed then for him was this agonizing period of looking for her in the impromptu morgues that had turned up, and also trying to find out if her name had turned up on the longer and longer and longer list of the dead that was being published by the Galveston newspapers.
For more than a week, Issac stays away from the Weather Bureau. Finally, on September 17, 1900, he returns to work. There is still no word on his wife's fate. As he enters the Levy building, which was spared by the hurricane, he thinks back to his insistence that the island could withstand any storm. His task now is to write the official U.S. Weather Bureau assessment of the Galveston disaster, a hurricane that has left thousands dead. A hurricane for which he gave no warning until it was too late. Exactly how will he tell this story? September 1900. The deadliest hurricane in U.S. history has laid waste to Galveston, Texas. Now, residents, along with relief groups and the Texas militia, are cleaning up the town. The task before them is monumental. 3,600 buildings have been destroyed, including City Hall, Galveston's gas company, and the city's waterworks. 9 churches have been completely wiped out, along with hundreds of homes. There are over 6,000 dead, 1/6 of the city's population. Funeral pyres blanket the island with a thick, noxious smoke. For some, the devastation is simply too much to take.
The railroads actually offered free passage to anyone who wanted to get off the island, and many, many people did. Many people got off the island and never came back. They didn't come back for their possessions. They were so horrified by the storm.
Many, however, stay and fight to rebuild their city.
There were a lot of people who fled. I don't mock them for it, but when I think about those who stayed, I realized how much effort they were willing to put in to really build this from nothing into a community. And that says something about the will of human beings and their faith.
Galveston Weather Bureau Chief Issac Klein is one of those who remain behind. His pregnant wife, Cora, is still missing. Day after harrowing day, he searches for her name among the lists of the dead and in the city's temporary morgues. For a time, this keeps him from his work. Finally, 9 days after the hurricane, he returns to his office in the Levy building for perhaps his most important task.
Issac then had to sit down and write a report about the storm. This was a kind of a tricky moment for him. He realized that he himself had underestimated the power of the storm.
In an even hand, Issac writes that storm warnings were timely and received a wide distribution not only in Galveston but throughout the coast region. He neglects to say that none of those warnings had included the word hurricane. He acknowledges that he did not understand some of the warning signs, but he also claims that on the morning of the storm, he ran along the beach warning townspeople that a killer was coming.
It's coming! Move inward!
As a result, he writes, thousands of people were saved.
And that's what, in fact, led ultimately to the legend of Issac Klein. There are a few problems with the legend. For one thing, mobility was very limited, if not impossible. These giant swells were coming in and had already torn buildings to pieces.
Another problem. There are no reports of anyone actually seeing Issac Klein on the beach.
Issac continued forever after to insist that he had saved thousands of lives, and later actually increased the total of people many times over. There was something very almost obsessive about how he claimed that later on, as if to really convince himself too that he had done right that day.
After finishing his report, Issac sends it to headquarters in Washington, D.C.
He recognized that this report would not only be important for his own career, but also would be important because he had the prestige of the Weather Bureau to look out for it.
In Washington, U.S. Weather Bureau Chief Willis Moore calls Issac one of the heroic spirits of that awful hour.
Put his own life at stake.
Moore wants to make sure that his agency doesn't receive any blame for the carnage.
The U.S. Weather Bureau never took any responsibility for the failure to call the storm. In fact, quite the contrary. Willis Moore actually went so far as to say that, well, in fact, hurricane warnings had been sent to Galveston.
September 30th, 1900. By now, Issac Klein's wife, Cora May, has been missing for 3 weeks.
Finally, one day, someone came to get him because they believed that they might, in fact, have at last found his wife. The place where they found her was right under the raft of debris that had brought him and his daughters to safety. He identified her from the diamond ring that he had given her as an engagement ring. He had to feel some sense of guilt. Here is this man who is charged with protecting the city of Galveston, all of Texas, from foul weather, and in the end fails to do it at the greatest cost to his own family, at the loss of his own wife.
A year after the storm, Issac is transferred to a Weather Bureau post in New Orleans. His brother Joseph is transferred to the weather station in Puerto Rico.
Out of this house! This house is coming down!
He never forgives Issac for failing to heed his warning the night of the storm.
It's as if whatever simmering conflict had shaped their competitiveness before at last came to the fore and caused an irreparable breach between the two.
Issac Klein would never remarry. In the wake of the Great Storm, he took up painting and continued to work for the Weather Bureau for another 3 decades. By the time he retired in 1935, the carnage of World War I and the chaos of the Great Depression had shattered the optimism that greeted the 20th century. Still, he clung to his faith in science as an agent of hope. Issac Klein died in 1955 at the age of 93. After his death, he passed into Galveston lore until author Eric Larson re-examined that fateful day in 1900.
One cuts through the legend that exists in Galveston. And what emerges, I think, is a much more powerful portrait of Issac Klein. Is that to say that he was a bad man? No, not at all. It's just to say that in that moment, the world of science that he represented met the most intractable of foes, and that is Mother Nature.
It would take the city of Galveston years to recover from the hurricane of 1900. In 1904, a 17-foot seawall covering 8 miles of shoreline was built to withstand assault from the Gulf of Mexico. In addition, the height of the entire island was raised.
They actually brought the sand in from the bay, getting this huge volume of sand they needed to elevate the island 13 feet.
By 1915, when there is another hurricane of equal strength and power to the 1900 storm, the island sustains minimal casualties. The leaders in the population of Galveston heave a sigh of relief and feel that its place has been regained and reassured as an economic center of the region.
But it wasn't to be. Oil was discovered outside of Houston, and that hole up the road became Texas's next boomtown. In 1914, the Houston Ship Channel opened.
The new one in Houston is much more protected and has much more land area surrounding it for the servicing of shipping and processing of those kinds of things.
Houston soon outstripped Galveston as Texas's center of commerce, and the island faded into obscurity. Today, Galveston is a sleepy resort town, population 57,000. Yet after more than a century, the memory of 1900 still shapes the city.
On a nice day like today, this is the best place in the world to be. Tomorrow it might rain. 3 months from now we might have a hurricane.
There is a charm and there's a magic about Galveston Island that keeps people here and keeps making people willing to risk their lives every June through November.
We who are still here know that there could be something much worse than we've ever had. Galveston has its own roots and its own spirit of joy, spirit of wanting to overcome.
We almost lost the city, and I think that brings about a deeper love and appreciation for what we have. I think that it's our love for this community that fires that spirit to defy nature's fury.
But many believe that someday another catastrophic hurricane will come, and no matter what improvements the islanders have made, the Gulf will once again swallow Galveston.
Today, it's over 100 years from the 1900 storm. What have we changed? Man against nature, man against the storms. The storm is so much more powerful.
I take the approach that it shouldn't be a struggle of man against nature. The good Lord gave us a brain so that we could figure out how to adapt and deal with it rather than fight it. So nature will win if we decide that we can beat it.
That's the whole reason the story is worth telling today. It's this moment when mere mortal man thinks he knows all there is to know about a phenomenon as complex as nature, and learns in excruciatingly inevitable way that there's so much we'll never know and never appreciate about the sheer power of nature.
but pricks live forever. Lactose-intolerant milk, kiss my that's what. I'm the greatest here, and you sniffling would die without me.
Louis Black, Black on Broadway, Saturday at 1, here in the Stash.
And that is a little obnoxious.
They gon' hate you, just gotta take it. You gotta take it. They not mad at us. We think they hate us. They don't hate us. They hate good. They used to want good, hope for good, and good didn't happen to them, and now these motherfuckers hate good. They don't hate us. They mad now because they got a raggedy car. They look at the Escalade like he made a up decision. They just, what he got 6 TVs for in there? It ain't even 6 motherfuckers in there. Don't you worry about it, raggedy bitch. Figure out how to get that duct tape off your tail light. Mind your goddamn business. It's 2007, bitch. This right here. I know some of y'all was expecting to hear some jokes from Pimp College Part 1, but I don't feel right charging y'all motherfuckers money to see some you already saw for free. So bear with a motherfucker. 2007 in this bitch. Life is too short for fun. Tell you, you only care about your kids, your friends, your family, and the person you're in a relationship with. Ladies, y'all are in charge of all relationships with us men. You know that. So get on your job. Yeah, even you, ma'am. Yes, please. She had Tourette. She just hollered out for no reason. 98! What? I'm just saying, ladies, if you're in a relationship, it's hard. It's hard. Y'all can't keep talking about men. Make up your mind. You either with us or you ain't. Getting tired of women walking around talking about well, bitch, you need to either get you a girlfriend or shut up and join the goddamn game. It's your relationship, ladies. It's your relationship. Some of y'all are being greedy. Some of y'all out there looking for 100% good. And let me just tell you, I had a meeting with all these in attendance tonight, and we established there is no such a so stop looking for the mother. And if we did have that, he wouldn't want your mother ass. He'd be looking for 100%. Ain't no perfect people, ladies, and sometimes you set the sights too high and don't give no credit. Some of y'all had 98% good, 98%. You got rid of them for 2%. 98% good. Went to work, made a check, brought it back, shared it with you, put gas in the car, didn't beat on you, took care of your kids better than his own kids. He can't even see his kids. He rubbing your son's hair and put his backpack on in the mornings. You done got rid of that for 2%. Now, right now, you sitting here with a 71% hoping he upgrade. Look at you, can't even clap because he look at you. Just saying, ladies, you gotta be happy. How you gonna have a 98% good? You got rid of that for 2% because he cheated on you a little 2%. You, oh, what, it's different now? Ladies, like, that's a big 2. The fellas are with me, please make this work. Please, please, I don't know what you gonna do, please. Just gotta understand, ladies, is complicated. Part of your responsibility in a relationship is making sure your man don't cheat. Help out. You know, lose focus. We easy to lose focus. We just want to work and play and eat, and not necessarily in that order, because if we ain't even hungry, we just, I ate yesterday, I'm good. Still need a Tic Tac, something just. Ladies, it's time to do some new. If you're in a relationship and you want to keep the relationship, you got to do certain things to keep racking